From Barangaroo Studios, the ausbiz COB is the key stuff you need to know about the day in business and finance.
This is a COB, all the stuff you need to know about the day in business and markets. I'm Juliette Sarli.
And I'm Daniela Couillet.
All right, Danny, let's have a look at where the market is ending up on a day where we kind of ended where we started, but we did see that pick up around 1 o'clock, and that was pretty much when the China data was released, which we'll get to in a moment, but only finishing up by about 0.2% there on the CBO 200 index.
Yeah, and it looks about the same on the ASX 200. That's up just over 12 points or 0.18%, exactly the same. So there we go.
And it was a beat when it comes from China. It's always really interesting, this data, because particularly as we get towards the end of the year, it's interesting how they seem to always just get towards that 5% target. But 4.9% in July to September from the year earlier. When you just look at the quarter on quarter, I think it was a gain of around 1.3%. Still, though, a beat, and that was why we saw that pickup coming through in the market around that 1 o'clock time frame, and a little bit of a pickup in the Aussie too. And we also had, before that data, Michelle Bullock speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And just reading what she was saying at the fireside chat, I mean, it seems to me, yes, we are data dependent. Obviously, we have labour figures out this week and the big CPI for September quarter on October the 25th. But it just seems like we have to be aware that the RBA may well lift again. It's interesting chatting to Martin Lakos from Macquarie. They've now actually factored that out.
Really?
Yes, which I thought was really interesting.
So they don't see a hike?
Yeah, they don't see another hike. They've actually brought down sort of the terminal rate from 4.35 to where it is currently. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, but the market's not looking for them to hike in November, but it is discounting a hike by March next quarter. But who knows what'll happen by then? There's a lot of water to come under the bridge, isn't there, Jules?
Indeed, there is. The other interesting factor was, this potential merger in the media industry. I mean, these are small caps when you look at the likes of Southern Cross, but huge when you look at the reach of these radio stations. And it does really seem that this is coming at the same time that there was already a bit of a talent war for two of their key presenters, of course, Jackie O and Kyle Sandilands. There's something like a $200 million 10-year deal on the table here, according to reports. So ARN had already taken a now near 15% stake in Southern Cross, and now, of course, they're taking this takeover bid worth about $143 billion. So that was one story we were watching there. Kiss tempting.
And I'm going to say, video didn't kill the radio star.
No, those two have always been at the top of the game.
I'm not sure our guest sitting here in the studio is old enough to remember that song, but anyway, I just make the point that narratives sometimes go awry.
We can get to William in a second, but he should watch The Wedding Singer, because that is such a great... Have you seen that movie with Adam Sandler?
Yeah, I have, but I don't remember.
Well,
he sing?
Yeah,
Video
he sings Video Kills the Radio Star. And
there we go.
It's brought that song back to a lot of the youth, shall we say. All right, let's move on and look at some of these stocks, because Southern Cross Media did rally 18.5% after it received that takeover offer, finishing up by about 18% from ARN and Anchorage, and it values the target at 94 cents a share. So finishing there at 86 cents.
And AMP has posted its Q3 full calendar operations update, showing the company has exited the third quarter standing, albeit somewhat bruised.
We also had, of course, the impact on Whitehaven Coal, the BHP update as well, and Credit Corp ending there down by 30.4%.
Yeah, so basically they bought a debt book in the US and they've had to write it down. So there's been a substantial downgrade in earnings from Credit Corp. Yeah, that is absolutely bruising, because I spoke to the CEO only a few weeks ago post the earnings. So clearly shareholders won't be too happy with that one.
What was the story with Auto? I'm not sure I know that one, but it was down 4.4%. I also wanted to touch on Setire, because that was really interesting. They saw their revenue double today.
And yes, the stock of the day was a Setire. So let's check in and see what our guests had to say.
The business model still works. The numbers are big in terms of percentages, but I can't really get that excited. It's a hold from me at the moment. I think the market reaction today probably says it all, and volumes are low, and we have seen Dean Mintz sell some shares not that long ago. I can't remember when, but it wasn't that long ago. So clearly
that LVMH share price down 23% over the last 6 months. So there's certainly some trouble brewing in that sort of high-end space. If you look at the actual numbers, they've got about a 59% return on equity, which is outstanding, but their profit margin, as you would expect with a retailer, is only about 3.6%. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there, and if they're left holding inventory and things go bad, then there's potentially some real issues there. So it's an okay business, and as I said, ROE stands up, but it's a hold.
Well, welcome to the COB, William Symes from Macro Capital, who just told us he does know the song Video Killed the Radio Star. Yes, come back.
Well, he's giving me the shaky head. Sorry about that, Will.
It's fine. We'll let that one slide.
We'll let that one slide. Tell us what you thought about the China data.
Look, it was strong data, and I think it really adds to the additional stimulus measures that we've seen out of China recently. Obviously, they're trying to tread a pretty fine line between providing ample liquidity and then also balancing against the risk of the yuan selling off further with this higher for longer story out of the US. So already cut the MLF rate twice this year, but then injected another 289 billion yuan into the system to provide, I guess, additional liquidity for the banking system. And so I think that'll be quite strongest for them. It's the biggest net injection they've had for nearly 3 years at this point in time. And authorities have mandated that local governments need to spend the money from those bond issuances inside of the next month. So should be quite a big positive impact for stimulus that we haven't yet seen. So markets are still quite cautious about whether the economy is actually going to recover from here. But ultimately, we've seen a lot of institutions come out and actually raise their targets for China. So I think that there are still issues in the space, but ultimately it does look like it is improving, particularly with the manufacturing data recently and then the industrial figures out today. So an area that we are looking at a little bit more so now that some of the uncertainty has cleared up. The other thing today was a report out of World Steel, which indicated that they anticipate the Chinese property crisis to probably abate towards the latter end of the year, and they're expecting steel demand to grow by about 2% for 2023. And that's likely to continue into 2024 if these continuing stimulus measures do keep going through. So definitely an area that we're looking at potentially gaining a little bit of exposure to. Rio's report yesterday, reasonably muted from investors, but they did say that they saw iron ore remaining in that $100, $130 vicinity over the next 6 months. And if we do see these stimulus measures continuing to roll out, I think it's likely to push to the upper bound of that range and provide a bit of support for some of the miners domestically.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we were chatting for literally weeks about, you know, why is the iron ore price so firm? And, you know, the narrative was, you know, China's reopening is not so great. But yet again, they seem to be managing it probably better than sort of us on the outside looking in. So, absolutely. Yeah, what would your sort of preference be amongst the miners at this stage, Will?
Look, I think that they're all reasonably similar in their exposure. Fortescue's had a nice run recently. Mineral Resources is definitely struggling, and I think that's largely due to the pretty heavy exposure towards lithium. But look, I like all the miners as longer term investments. The top three are all quite high yielding positions. BHP's had a strong rally. We've got some BHP exposure through a put strategy that we've got at the moment, so probably some BHP.
Let's talk about Liontown. I mean, you would expect if somebody walks away from a $6.6 billion takeover, that is a huge ouch. They've asked for this trading hold to be extended. What does it mean for them? They're going to have to try and, you know, really raise some significant capital now.
Look, it's definitely a tricky situation. I mean, it's been a very lengthy process. The first offer was back in October last year at 220. upped it 3 or 4 times to $3 most recently, and then Gina Reinhart's kind of put a spanner in the works there. So a slight reference to her in Albemarle's statement on Monday. But realistically, I think that shareholders are probably in for a bit of pain from here. I mean, the stock was trading 160 prior to the first offer. The most recent trade was 279 prior to the trading halt, so it's rallied 74 odd %. And so I think that realistically they're going to struggle to find the funding in a quick time frame. But then also with the takeover having been pulled, I think that we're going to see a fair bit of downside for the stock quite quickly. I mean, you look at Tyro recently, when their takeover offer got pulled, they dropped by something like 40% over 3 weeks and got absolutely rinsed. And there hasn't been a whole lot of positive sentiment flowing back into the stock yet either. So typically what we look to do when there are these takeover offers is that we look to trim into it, because once the stock gets a few % away from the takeover price, you're not playing for much more reward, but you're taking on a huge amount of risk. And so typically we'll look to trim into takeover offers. But yeah, I think it's unfortunate for shareholders, and I think there'll be a fair bit of downside from here.
Do you have any thoughts on Whitehaven buying BHP's coal assets? I know there's an activist investor that's not too happy about it over in the UK, but Whitehaven has been particularly keen on putting their hand up.
Well, I mean, there are a number of bidders for it. Whitehaven's won out, and they've obviously rallied quite a lot on the day on the back of it, so I think it'll be quite positive for them. We actually put a recommendation out of them last week or so doing reasonably well on that one, but I think ultimately it'll be good for them. There's obviously activist investors against it, but realistically I think everyone's getting a little bit ahead of the time frame with this net zero thing. We're going to need coal and other energy sources for a lot longer than what people are trying to price in.
Yeah, 7 years.
Yeah.
I think we're going to make it. All right, William, thank you. William
Appreciate
Symes from Macro Capital with us here on the COB. Let's take a look at the market leaders for the day. And Whitehaven Coal, as we were just talking about.
Isn't that an interesting reaction? Very happy campers there. The stock up by almost 12%. I wouldn't have picked that one.
Capricorn Metals also higher, up 6%. Treasury Wine Estate, that's continuing on that China theme, isn't it? Up by 5.4%. And looking at some of the laggards, Danny.
Yes, and Credit Corp, obviously for poor shareholders, taking the top pole position, down a bruising 30%, but it was a very hefty downgrade. Babcock continuing to fall post the AGM with downgrading of expectations there. Sierra Resources off by 6%, and looks like the profit taking came into Hub24 after they had those good quarterly inflow numbers yesterday, but it had reached an all-time high, and Cromwell Property under some selling pressure.
I think we've got the small caps as well. Lithium Power, Southern Cross Media, we were talking there. Yeah, but
Absolutely.
Lithium up 28%. Southern Cross Media on that takeover bid. So it's valuing, I think, as we were saying, about 94 cents a share when you look at the share placement and the cash offer. They closed up by 18% at 86 cents. Main Pharma also had some news out today that was to the upside. I think that was a broker upgrade as well for
Right,
Main. Yeah,
okay,
so
I
up by
didn't see that.
12%. And down to the downside for the small caps.
And Victus Energy looks like that's down 10%. Strickland Metals off by 8%. 4D Memory, which does seem to pop on and off these, leaders and laggards for the small caps. That's off 8%. And SmartPay down 7%. But let's check in and see what is happening overnight. Actually, we might already, maybe not with the time changes. I was going to say we might have had the UK CPI and PPI out, but because of the time changes, we haven't had that yet. Eurozone CPI for September, so those figures I think will be quite interesting. US Fed beige book, and I do know some economists absolutely trawl through that. I couldn't think of anything worse. And US housing starts, which probably it'll be interesting to see because the housing market in the US is one that has been deeply impacted.
Yep. And looking ahead tomorrow, jobs, that unemployment data that always seems like it's throwing a dartboard or throwing a, what do you call it? Throwing a dart
At
at the
a board,
dartboard.
exactly.
So for September, and of course a NAB business confidence survey as well. We've also got a bit of data out of Japan with the trade balance, and then a number of AGMs coming through.
Busy. The ASX was one that Rachel Waterhouse from the ASA talking about, and also Endeavour's coming up as well. So I'm sure shareholders definitely have a few things to say at the moment, so they could be quite interesting shareholders.
All right, looking at the closes, we have definitely finished out the day's trade, and pretty unchanged from where we started.
ASX 200 just up a peak more at 21.5 points,
or
0.3%.
Well, that's doing a lot better than the
COB
200.
Yes,
so
we're not quite sure how that calculation's come by, but looks like the markets did pick up towards the close this afternoon.
And as we mentioned, Whitehaven among the front runners, and over the last 5 days, the ASX 200 up by 0.5%. All right, that does it for today. And of course, so much happening tomorrow. We'll be back with all of those details
Absolutely.
from bright and early tomorrow.
Have a great evening.